Howdy y'all, I'm Charlie. Welcome to my channel. Today we're going to be talking about a subject near and dear to my heart. That is of course Disney's 2016 animated film, Zootopia. Zootopia, what a landmark movie. Well, at least for me. I actually point to Zootopia as kind of my genesis moment in the fandom, as sort of my way into becoming a furry. And I'm sure I'm not the only one. This movie is a big deal to a lot of people. What's there to say about Zootopia a few years later? Well, I have some thoughts. So, in relation to the title, I do in fact love this movie. It's well paced, the humor works for basically all age levels, it's beautifully animated, it's a really heartwarming tale, and, spoiler alert, it stars my husband.
With that cute fuzzy wuzzy little tail.
The aesthetic of the film really passed the vibe check with furries. Really, do you remember this teaser trailer? Do you remember this? The character design and execution of various personalities, fan art galore. I was always partial to the wolves in the film, of course, and it was the fan art of the wolves that actually really got me into the furry fandom. I loved Zootopia when it came out. I saw it 5 times in theaters, and that was before I was a furry. Or I guess more accurately, it was sort of my process of becoming a furry. There's a lot to love in this movie. Let's consider the two main characters. Judy and Nick have such great chemistry on screen. They make a great duo and their banter is fun to watch, and there's a lot of quotable moments.
Did you just boot my stroller?
They both go through a process of self-discovery and moral reckoning, which is really cool to see happen. Of course, Judy accomplishes her dream of becoming a police officer, and she confronts her own implicit bias, which ends up having disastrous effect on members of her community. More about this later. Through knowing Judy, Nick finds a greater purpose with his life besides being kind of like a scummy con man sort of guy. Even more, Nick finds a greater sense of self-worth through helping other people. So in this movie, we get 2 big transformations, which is just so awesome to see happen on screen. I associate so many positive emotions with this movie. Seeing this movie was kind of my own process of self-discovery and becoming a furry. It's a movie that I've seen countless times with friends who I love. And all in all, it's just a pretty good movie. The movie was largely well received by people too. Here's the Metacritic score. However, there are some criticisms of the film that I would like to address here, namely the film's discussion of racism. Zootopia, a movie that stars animal characters and has a moral lesson, appears to be a movie that's an allegorical tale. The fact that we have a protagonist who has a bias towards violent species and who is a police officer really hammers home that the movie wants us to consider sort of biases we see in real life, namely racial biases. To recap, Judy is raised in a family who believes that foxes are not to be trusted. She had a bad run-in with a queer icon, Gideon Grey, towards the beginning of the movie, and she carries Fox repellent with her through a majority of the movie's playtime. Once certain animals start becoming violent, Judy makes a very public claim that it is predators who are becoming violent, or what she says, going savage. The movie opens with Judy, as a child, telling some kind of origin story of a pre-civilized time when predators ate prey, and prey were in fear of predators. These days, everyone gets along, and the threat of violence is kind of subdued, or at least it's not really talked about at all. I think it's also worth noting that when Gideon Grey bullies Judy at the beginning of the movie, that kind of violence is different than the sort of Train to Busan zombie kind of thing we see happen whenever predators get struck by the night howler. Also, spoiler alert. Nevertheless, all of this combined instills in Judy a kind of bias towards predators, or at least foxes. This implicit bias affects her actions even if she doesn't want it to. Remember, she carries the fox repellent with her even after her and Nick become friends, and she's ready to wield it even after they sort of developed a bond and got to know each other. So a critique I see of the film that I think is a little misinformed is whenever people try to create a sort of one-to-one metaphor of the moral lesson of racism in the story. That is, people are saying that prey represent white people and predators represent people of color. From this premise, they say that the movie is actually super problematic because it confirms the sort of bias that people have with real-life racism. A good example of this in practice is the Wisecrack video, "Is Zootopia racist?" The video essayist claims that the movie makes a one-to-one metaphor where prey are white people and predators are people of color, and that this becomes problematic once you start to take the movie apart.
Racial prejudice in the world of Zootopia came from real biological differences and real history.
According to the essayist, the movie claims that predators are violent due to their biology and a sort of real history, some kind of rhetoric that the movie throws around over and over and over again. In real life, of course, actual predators do eat prey, a reality that the movie seems to establish used to be the case for the animals in the film, but is the case no longer after some kind of evolutionary process. If you continue the one-to-one metaphor that predator and prey still have this instinct, then the premise is kinda, not good, it implies that predators are still innately violent due to their biology. This would seem to say that the movie is suggesting that people of color are innately violent and have to like hide this urge that they have for hurting white people. Bad! Thus, the movie's take that we should get over our biases is flawed because it implies that there's some inherent difference between races, one predicated on violence. Not good! Therefore, Zootopia is actually a really terrible commentary on racism in real life. Now, I do think the movie is flawed in its commentary on racism, but I don't think that this take gives the movie enough credit. I disagree that the movie establishes a one-to-one metaphor where prey represent white people and predators represent people of color. Rather, I think that the movie implies that biases go in all directions. For instance, Judy becomes a police officer due to a mammal inclusion initiative, which is like a kind of diversity program. She also corrects offensive language from a predator about her species. Also, she wants to break the stereotype of being a dumb bunny, like what Nick calls her. If Judy, prey, was to represent white people, these sorts of things wouldn't really make sense in real life. The movie sort of implies that the biases Judy faces are somewhat equivalent to the biases other species face. Additionally, I don't think the history that predators used to eat prey and prey used to live in fear of predators, I don't think that that's like an actual real history in the movie. We are given this history at the outset of the movie, but I think context is important. It happens at like a celebration fair sort of thing, and it's children who are telling the story. I think an accurate comparison would be the way children tell stories about like Thanksgiving and these sorts of things, right? We tell false histories to fit certain narratives all the time, like erasing the genocide of indigenous people, right? So I think this history where predators used to eat prey is actually completely fabricated. Like, that wasn't a reality. That never happened. Some more evidence to support this point would be to go back to the biology argument. If it was true within the universe of the movie that the night howler makes predators revert back to kind of like a pre-civilized society state, then the comment that Judy's mom makes at the end doesn't really make sense.
Yeah, Terry ate one whole when we were kids and went completely nuts.
He bit the dickens out of your mother.
A bunny can go savage.
Bunnies can go savage. The night howler doesn't revert animals back to these sort of original ways. Rather, it sort of trained to Busan zombies them. Due to the night howler, predators and prey become violent alike. Predators do not revert back to their original ways because there's no original ways to revert back to. In my opinion, the current relationship between the animals, where they all sort of live in harmony or whatever, has historically been the reality in the world of Zootopia. Thus, the argument that the movie draws a one-to-one metaphor where prey represent white people and predators represent people of color, I don't think really holds water. I don't think that's what the movie is really claiming at all. Now, here's sort of my issue with the movie's discussion of racism. Within the universe of the movie, biases run in all directions and have similarly bad effects for all species. Rabbits like Judy have been denied equal employment just by virtue of their species. Nick, of course, has faced harassment of all sorts because he is a fox. Bellwether endures mistreatment by her boss and presumably other predators, thus making her the villain. Thus, the movie erases the reality that biases overwhelmingly negatively impact people of color. Going on now are marches protesting the historical and ongoing mistreatment of black people due to police violence. The movie implies that racism impacts all people equally, or at least roughly equally, which is not a good lesson at all. Racism impacts people of color, and unlearning racism, like what Judy does throughout the movie, is a responsibility white people need to take on, and understanding one's racial bias, like what Judy does, is a great first step. Even more, racism in the United States exists at institutional systemic levels that people spend their whole lives studying and analyzing. Judy, as an individual, wrecks the lives of predators, and then her as an individual, or I guess with Nick too, sort of like corrects racism in all of Zootopia. The movie implies that racism only exists at the individual level, or at the very least doesn't explore the way that racism existed in larger institutions within Zootopia. At first I found it kind of enduring that Judy quits the force. It seems sensical that the police force in Zootopia may enforce racism in a way that Judy herself can't correct. But rather than this, Judy sort of sees herself as the crucial issue here and is able to fix everything by herself. Thus, the movie ignores the reality that the police as an institution may reinforce racism beyond merely the individual level. That, in my opinion, does not teach a very good lesson about racism in the real world. And I ask, what is utopic about Zootopia? Judy's biggest dream is that she gets to have a job? that kind of sucks. There's also, in general, a lot of policing of behavior. The wolves can't howl, you can't be naked, you have to walk on two paws. What's the point of being an animal in a utopic animal community where you all sort of like live together if your behavior has to be regulated so much that it's so stifling you have to seek an underground in order to sort of express yourselves in ways you want to? See Emma Otterson. Where is the utopia in that? I see this movie as Disney's attempt to sort of absolve itself of its racist past. A lot of my opinions in this video are informed by this article. Flory argues that Zootopia is a movie made for white audiences in its discussion of implicit racial bias. Judy is ultimately a sympathetic racist character that white audiences can identify with in her unlearning racial bias. The directors effectively made a movie for a white child audience, which Disney has been doing forever. Flory also discusses a lack of discussion of systemic racism within the movie Zootopia. All that being said, I mostly agree with Flory's quote here. At the same time, I want to acknowledge that what Zootopia does far more daringly and successfully than most, if not all of its Disney predecessors, is directly confront implicit racial bias. Its narrative explicitly poses the social problem of what it might mean if individuals presumptively and unthinkingly impose negative, false stereotypes on a minority of their fellow citizens. Zootopia does show the effects of racism and makes a direct commentary on that, so I guess that's a win. Despite these criticisms, I still really love Zootopia as a movie, like what I talked about at the beginning of this video. I think it's important to be critical of the media we enjoy and consume, which is what this video is sort of doing. I also think unlearning racism, like what the movie is suggesting and what the Wisecrack video ultimately says it's doing in kind of the abstract, is a really important lesson to learn. And the fact that it comes from a movie for children is actually pretty cool. So all in all, Zootopia is a movie that I will be critical of, but it's a movie I'm probably gonna see a gazillion more times after already seeing it a gazillion times. Alright, thank you so much for watching my video. Please consider donating to Indigenous efforts. I have a link in the doobly-doo. So yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. See you next time. Bye!